The focus of this video is on creating an architectural exterior daylight still frame render. I'll be setting this up with the Mental Ray daylight system using the Mental Ray Sun and Mental Ray Sky. Using, of course, Mental Ray. I will be using indirect illumination, and this will be a still frame render instead of an animation. I will have a separate video on animation, as the topic there can get rather in depth, and I just wanted to break this down into still frames and then animations as a separate video, because I think that will allow me to cover each in depth a little bit better. So what I have here is a architectural model, and if I just switch to a perspective view and pan around here, you can see that I've scattered some trees about here. And the trees really don't have a texture, more so just a color map applied to them. Now, I'm not going to get real in-depth on materials in this particular video because, again, the focus is more so on setting up a typical daylight render for an architectural scene. But I'll have a more in-depth video on materials themselves later, so if you need information on that, you can go to that particular video. But I will bring some of the materials in here just for a quick view, such as this material here. Most of the materials that I use, I believe probably all of them, are Arc and Design materials. This brick map, I've just gone in and assigned a brick texture map to the diffuse color here of this Arc and Design material. I generally pipe all of my materials through this gamma and gain utility shader due to the gamma settings that I'm using. Again, I don't want to get sidetracked on a discussion on gamma, but I'll just briefly hit on this here. And again, I have a more in-depth tutorial on gamma specifically, but the gamma settings that I'm using for this scene, you can see I'm using a gamma correction of 2.2 for my viewport display. And then I'm saving out the images as gamma 2.2. I have a bitmap input gamma of 1.0, and that's really the reason why I pipe everything through this gamma and gain shaders, because most of these texture maps, like this brick map that I've made, is an actual gamma 2.2 image. So I'm just gamma correcting that. One of the neat things about using this gamma and gain shader is that you can sort of lighten or darken the color, if you will. Of course, 2.2 would be the closest to the actual result, but I want that just a little bit lighter, so I set it for 1.8. The other brick texture in the scene is basically set up the same way. That may be the same one. Same type setup. So the materials do play a vital role in the scene here, as far as the color of light bounced and things like that. But more so, I just want to talk about setting up the lighting system and things like that, instead of getting hung up on a material discussion, which I have another video for. So to go ahead and get started here, again, there's no lights in the scene. It's just an empty scene here. And if I've got the scene broken down into different layers, so I'm going to make sure I'm on layer 0 here, and I'll just go ahead and start adding a light source. First light that I'm going to add is the daylight system. And I'm just going to switch to a top viewport here and go up, and let's go and add a daylight system. And yes, I want to use exposure control, so I'm just going to say yes to that. And with the left mouse button holding down, I'm just dragging out this daylight system, and I'll say yes to add a Mental Ray physical sky to the environment, and then click to stop the creation of the Mental Ray sky. And so that's in there. At this point, I'm not really too concerned about north and south, east and west here, but of course I can rotate that around. Something like so will probably work fine. And in 3D Studio Max 2009 and 2010, by default, Final Gather is already enabled. Now, this particular scene, I've already added some bounces. Let me reset that. You'll have this diffuse bounce set to 0. And it'll probably come in at some settings similar to this. The speckle reduction will be at standard, and what this will do with these particular settings will give you a fast preview render. So what I'll do is, to make that even faster, as I'm setting up the lights, I'll set this down to draft. Now, for architectural exteriors such as this scene here, I generally prefer to use just final gather only rather than global illumination plus final gather. You can use either method. Just know that if you do use global illumination, remember to go back into the mental ray daylight system here, into the mental ray sun, and make sure that you use this photon targeting option, so that those photons are only generated where you need it. So if I did want to use photons for this particular scene, what I would do is come in and increase this radius to something like so that these photons, as they're generated, they're only focused on my scene and not being shot or fired all over the place and away from the scene as well. But as I said, for this particular scene, and for most architectural exteriors, generally final gather by itself does an excellent job of illuminating the scenes. Now, another feature here that if you're using a newer version of 3D Studio Max is the viewport capabilities that we have now. As you can see, I can see the daylight system here in my viewport as I pan around. So let me just select this daylight system again, and if I go to a camera viewport or camera view here, and as I move that sun system, I'll be able to see in real time what the scene is going to look like rendered, minus of course the indirect illumination calculations. This is all just going to be direct light. But well, I have to go in and set the sky to manual in order to be able to move that without having to set the time and day. I'm just going to put it in manual rather than go through clicking the hours of the day and things like that. So as I move this around, you can see the light changing. And one thing I need to enable here to help visualize this is shadows in the viewport. I could also enable ambient occlusion if I wanted to. And so as you move your daylight system around, you'll get kind of a real-time update, which is pretty good, pretty handy to have now. So what I want to do is just put the sun somewhere like so. That looks good. And just give this a test render. And as the render completes, you can see it's a little bit on the dark side, and there's not a lot of bounce light going on, but I do have some nice soft shadows coming in from that tree. Now what I want to do is go in and start using some bounces on the final gather. So I'll just go to the indirect illumination tab and increase the bounces to something around like 4. As you can see, when you hover over some of the items here, you'll get a little tooltip that will help you in the configuration stages. So I'm just going to set this to 4. Now if I wanted to use more than that, let's say if I wanted to use 7, it's going to be limited by this trace depth setting here. So you'd want to make sure that you go in and you don't want your diffused bounces here under final gather to be higher than the trace depth settings here. So if I wanted to use 7, for example, I would just go ahead and put 7 for each of these. But generally that's too much for an exterior rendering like this. The extra calculation time really doesn't produce enough results over, say, something like 3 or 4 on an exterior render to warrant the extra render time. So keep that in mind, that you don't want to go too high here, and you don't really need to for exteriors. So I'm going to set that up for 4. I'll leave the render set to draft for now, and actually I'm going to decrease this render size for the testing phase, because that'll give me faster results. I don't really need the final render to render the test scene here at the final render size. I'll do that on the last render. If you notice, I have the image precision down to the default setting, which is 1/4 and 4. Again, that's to speed things up during the setup phase of your scene. You don't want to, again, you don't want to jack up all the settings immediately off the bat when you're setting up the lights and the textures, because that's just added render time that's not needed. Okay, so let me just give this another test render. And so now I have a preview of it that I can still see that it's a little bit dark, but I have more bounce light by increasing that diffuse bounce value. You can see under the overhang here in this walkway, I have more light as well as down here. And that looks pretty good the way it is. I think now I just need to go back and tune my exposure control settings to make this a little bit brighter. I'll also want to adjust the mental ray sun and mental ray sky perhaps to give a little more color depth to this image. And the good thing is, by decreasing the render size and using this draft quality, I can still get a good preview of this, and it only took less than a minute, whereas the previous render at full resolution was over 2 minutes in render time. So again, you can see how useful it is to scale down the render size here when you're setting up the scene. So what I want to do is go into my mental ray sun and sky settings here. And let me just go ahead and tune this mental ray sun. To see this effect, I'm going to go and use the material override option. In the processing tab here, I have a material override. And what that's going to do is just what it sounds like. It's going to override all the materials in the scene with one particular material. So I'm just going to go in and put a Arc and Design material in and drag this over to the material editor as an instance copy. I'm going to set the color to kind of a white, off-white if you will, and I don't want to calculate any ray trace reflections, so I'm going to set this for highlights and FG only mode. Maybe set the reflectivity down to something like so. Again, this will speed up the setup phase of the lighting in that it's not having to ray trace all the reflections of all the materials that you have in your scene. You can quickly go through and set up the lighting if that's your focus using this material override. One thing to note is that the glass here in this scene, let me switch to a perspective view, that material override is going to override every material in the scene, so that includes your glass. So if you wanted to, one thing that I like to do is put everything on a layer. So I have a glass layer here. I can go in and hide this just so that it doesn't block the interior of my scene here, so that when I use this material override, I can still see how the light bounces inside the area here and get an idea of what it'll look like with the glass. Okay, so let me close that and go back to my camera view, give this another render. So now, instead of having all the materials in the scene, it just has one material, and that's the only change that I made was to enable that material override, and my render time went down to 22 seconds instead of 52, I think it was. So for setting up and configuring the light, this may be a good option when you get into the lighting phase, to use that material override so that you can quickly set up the lighting in your scene without having to wait for those material calculations and ray tracing calculations. And so it also makes it easier to see what color your sun and sky is putting out when you have kind of a neutral color object to test that on. So what I want to do is disable that inherit from mental ray sky option on the sun settings, because I want to specify a different color for the sun, and I want this sunlight to be a little bit warmer, so I'm going to bump up the red value. And remember, I have a previous video on just the mental ray sun and sky. The higher the value here, the more towards the red spectrum you go, and then negative values are cool colored light. So I'm going to set that to 0.3 and render again. And so now I have a more saturated warm light tone here. I could decrease that saturation, which I may want to, just subtle, just a little amount, so it's not so saturated, and maybe want to decrease that to something like 0.2. Now I could go and I could also tune the mental ray sky if I wanted to. I'm going to leave it like this for my final render, but if I wanted to, I could naturally come and do the same for it as I just did with the mental ray sun. I could make it more red or more blue. I could decrease the saturation, maybe for like a cloudy kind of look, or overcast day, you may want to decrease the saturation. And by doing so, you'll end up with that kind of neutral grayish colored sky. But I'm just going to set it back to the default settings of 0 and 1. And maybe add just a touch of haze to this sky. Again, as you increase that, you can kind of see the change here in the viewport, which again is an excellent tool so that you don't have to render these things every time you make the changes. So I'll set that to something like 0.5. Now if you notice the grain in the or the noise here and the shadow, I could go ahead and increase the shadow samples here. Or perhaps since the sun is low on the horizon, I may want to increase the softness first. Let's just increase that to something like 8 and try that. So that's probably a bit too much. You get this really blown out shadow here, so I probably should bump that down to like 4. Now as you can see all the grain here again in this shadow, I know I'm going to have to increase this because I had to increase it at the default setting, so I'm going to bump that up to 24. And that looks a little more, a little better. There's still a fair amount of noise here, and of course I could go and increase these samples further to help clear that noise. But as you increase these samples, your render time's also going to increase, as it has obviously more calculations to do. So rather than do that, one thing is when I turn off this material override, where this white material is in the scene right now and the brick material is back in here, you're really not going to notice that noise as much on that brick pattern as you do on a solid white material, because that brick pattern has a bump map to it and it's kind of a rough texture. So as you can see, when that noise is on this, it would actually just kind of look like some depth in the surface imperfections or bump of that brick map. So it actually could work to your favor to leave some of that noise in there for both render speed as well as to give a little bit of noise to that texture map. So I'm going to leave it as it is. Now, as you know, I went in and changed the red-blue value of the mental ray sun system here. And one thing to watch about that is as the sun rises here, if I move this up, you're generally around noon, you're not going to have such a strong yellow saturated color. So I would have to manually go in and decrease this as the sun moves, if that is the effect that I'm after, rather than have such a saturated color when the sun is high in the sky like that. If you leave it enabled in this inherit from mental ray sky, it will automatically change colors for you, but it may not be the colors that you want for like a early morning or late afternoon shot, when generally you want a more saturated light. So you may want to leave that unchecked, but if you do, just know that you'll have to go in and manually change this value as your daylight system moves, because again, you don't want like a really saturated sunlight at noon time. We'll set that back to 0.25 and lower this back down like so. Go back to my camera view, and what I want to do now is adjust my exposure settings. So I'm using the mental ray photographic exposure control, and I can see this in the viewport as well. As you can see, as I decrease it, the viewport gets blown out. That's pretty much what the render would look like, minus the indirect illumination. So I want to leave that around, I can't decide between 13 or 14 for the EV value here. Probably leave that at 14. And looking at the sample render, let me just go ahead and render another one here with this new setting. And that looks a lot better. One thing that I may want to add is more contrast to this render. I'll get more contrast once I turn off this material override and I actually use my textures. But as you can see, I may want just a little bit more in the lighting itself. So in order to do that, what I can do is just adjust the midtone value here on the exposure control settings. For example, if I decrease this, let me close this down so that you can see what's going on in the viewport here. If you decrease this, you're going to get more more contrast in your scene. Let me just set that to 0.5. That's going to be too much, I think, but you'll be able to see the effect that it has. And so yeah, that's a little too much contrast here in the scene. So a good value for that would be something like 0.85. 0.85 to 1 seems to work pretty well. If the highlights were too bright, if I had too much burn in here, I could decrease that value to, if I had too many white spots, I could decrease that to eliminate some of the burn. I can also change the color saturation, which I'm fairly happy with the color saturation here. I don't want to go too strong. As you can see, it becomes kind of cartoony. So if you're going to put a value in there, you may want to use something like between 1 and 1.2. You don't want to go probably beyond 1.2 because, as you can see, it quickly goes to cartoon land when you do. Your white point value, you can change that if you wanted to. My camera actually uses for a daylight shot, it uses a Kelvin value of 5400, I believe. And finally, you have vignetting, which is what happens when you enable that. Is it gives that dark edges around your scene here. Pretty sure you can see that in the viewport too. If I increase that, you can see it getting darker at the edges here. Normally a good value to use for that is 4. Generally you don't want to go higher than 8, but it kind of depends on your lens length for your camera here too. For example, if I zoom in, you can see kind of how that effect gets stronger, even though I haven't changed the value here. So let me give this another render and see what we have. Alright, so there's what I have now, and I believe I'm ready to disable that material override, because this kind of looks like a cool winter's morn, if you will, kind of a cool morning. So let's just go in and disable that material override. Again, it's in the processing tab, and I'm just going to disable that. I'm going to go ahead and increase my resolution for the final resolution, and I'm going to increase the image precision. As you can see, I'm using a Lancos filter just because it's a more sharp filter. It will increase your render times if you're using these sharper filters. Box is the default filter, and it's a good all-around filter. It gives kind of a dull result, though. If you want sharper results inside of the render, you can do either Mitchell or Lancos. And I'll just give this a render. And there's the completed render. One thing that you'll notice that I forgot to do was unhide the glass. Remember, I had went in and disabled this glass layer. So make sure that you don't do what I just did and go through the rendering process and leave something like that out. If you did and you wanted to re-render it, you could just simply go in and use the selected items and the subset of pixel option in the viewport to go in and just select the glass, and you could render that by itself instead of having to re-render the entire image. Save yourself some time that way. So I'm fairly happy with the way that this looks. I think the lighting is complete. The only thing that I may want to do here is, what if I wanted to add some clouds to the sky? Of course, I could go in and I could just save this image as it is, of course after I add in the glass that I forgot to unhide a while ago. But I could save this image as is and use the alpha component here as a mask to add a cloud picture, say in Photoshop or something like that. The drawback to doing that is that, of course, it will not show up in the glass, whereas if I rendered a cloud texture map or something in the sky here with clouds in it, then I would actually get those reflections in the glass. And there are a couple of approaches that you can take to add clouds to your sky. Let's just take a look at these. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of different ways that we can add clouds to this scene. Let me just go into a perspective view here. And once again, if I rotate around, you can see it, we have the mental ray physical sky in this scene, and there's no clouds, so it's just a flat kind of a neutral looking sky. Nothing wrong with that on a clear day, but perhaps you want to add some clouds to this. Now you can approach this a couple of ways. One would be you can add clouds to the mental ray physical sky, and there's a couple of particular workflows that you have to take into consideration when doing that. Another method is to just simply add a sky picture, a picture of the sky, if you will, to your environment of the scene instead of using the mental ray physical sky. And of course, there's a third way in which you just add the a picture of the sky in post. But what I'm going to look at here is just the two methods. One, using a sky background, and then also using a picture of some clouds in the mental ray physical sky. Okay, so now since I already have the mental ray physical sky set up in this scene, let me just bring up my Environments and Effects tab here and open up the Material Editor. Give this a reset. What you would want to do is drag this mental ray physical sky from the environment map over to your material editor. To do that, naturally, you just grab it with the left mouse button, hold that down while you drag, and let go on one of these material shader icons here. And you're going to select Instance Copy, so that any changes you make here will be updated instantly to throughout the scene here. Let me just close that out. Alright, so the obvious choice here when you want to add clouds to this mental ray physical sky would be to use the custom background map. So what I'll do is just click on this None button here, and I want to assign a bitmap. And that's going to come up to a where you load bitmaps in. I've got some sky maps here, and I'll just scroll down and pick one of these guys, maybe that one. And I want to change the mapping coordinates, but before I do all of that and make any adjustments here, let's just go back because I need to enable this option. You have to make sure that just by loading that map in, it's not going to work. If I render this, it'll just be a black sky. So maybe what I'll do is just rotate this around since we're working on the sky, and speed things up. Maybe I'll come in and hide these trees. That way we can just focus on the sky here and get some quick renders out. I may even want to disable Final Gather like I've done here. Just again for setting up, things go quicker. I don't need Final Gather just to set up a sky or a lot of geometry. So let's just give this a render and see what happens. Okay, so as you can see, we're not seeing that image placed over here, so I have to enable this option. And if I render that again, now what you're going to see is you get this kind of haze at the horizon and a black sky, kind of a night sky. The reason that you get this haze it has nothing to do with this mental ray physical sky, any of the settings here. What that is actually the sky option, the mental ray sky. Here on the daylight system, this has an aerial perspective which puts a haze, kind of a volume effect haze out in the distance here that you can disable or enable if you want. And once you disable that, if you render again, what that will do is take out that haze area on your horizon. Okay, but now why do you get this black background instead of the picture of the sky that I've put in here? I'll just go ahead and drag this over to another swatch here so that we can make that an instance copy, and I can make changes later on. But you can see the sky is actually there, but it's not showing up. The reason that this happens is, think of it like this. If you go outside and you take a picture of the sky, and you bring it in and you print it out on your printer, and you take that picture out and you hold it up to the sky, which one will be brighter? obviously the actual sky is going to be brighter than a picture of the sky. And that's what's going on here. This sky that we have here in the background is a high dynamic range sky, meaning that it goes beyond the power of 1.0 pixel. It's a strong HDR effect. So this bitmap that we're using here is basically a picture of the sky. So it's a low dynamic range image. So in order for us to view that, we have to take into certain considerations. We can either have some options like boosting the energy of this bitmap. That's one option. For example, if I wanted to come down to the output function here and let's just max this out. I think 9,999 is the maximum, and render this again. And now you can see that we're getting the clouds, and you can kind of see this in the environment here. But of course, I've got this maxed out, the output amount. I can also increase the RGB level to, if I needed this a little bit brighter. Let's just bump this up to 4 just so that it's a visible effect. And now you can see that's considerably brighter. So that's one method that you can see this bitmap when using the photographic exposure control and the mental ray physical sky. It's kind of easy to remember because using this method you're actually boosting that output. So you know in your mind that, okay, well, I'm making this map stronger by boosting this amount. The downside is you'll have to fiddle with these values depending on what exposure setting you're using. So another option that you have to do this, let me just set this back to 1 and 1. Just close this down, and I need to bring up the environment and effects tab here, because what I want to look at is adjusting this physical scale. This is another option for changing the way that the energy of these bitmaps are interpreted, if you will. So what I'll do is enable unitless instead of the physical units mode on the mental ray photographic exposure control. Render that, and as you can see, it's still dark. It's starting to lighten up here in the background. So what I can do is increase this value. Let's say the sky, the sun value. What value should you plug in here? For a bright day like this, you may want to start out with something like 80,000. So just enter 80,000 and render again, and now you can see that this bitmap is visible. So that's another method that you can use. Instead of boosting these values, you could come over to your physical scale and go to unitless and adjust this. The upside of this method is that you're only adjusting one setting versus possibly 2 over here on the output. The downside of it is it's kind of hard to imagine this as actually boosting the energy, because you're not really boosting that bitmap like you were with this output amount. So really, either method will get you to the same point. It's just a matter of preference as to which way you get there. So the next thing that I want to do is just look at this bitmap that I'm using, because it's set up incorrectly, the mapping coordinates right now. We see it visible in the rendering. It's just that I need to change the mapping coordinates to a spherical environment. Now if I look at this image, let me just view this right quick. A little bit large. Let me decrease this down here. I believe this is a Marlin Studio sky from one of their collections. And as I scroll around, you can see it's just a hemispherical bitmap here. Lots of times you could map this to a dome of your scene, but really you don't need to do that. One way that you can actually use these is to adjust the offset and the mirror tile feature here. So what I want to do is I'm going to adjust this vertical offset and give it a negative 0.5 offset, and what you can see that's going to do is kind of split this up. I also need to fix, I could leave it like that I guess, but one thing I like to do is also adjust the mirror versus tile option. I'm going to set that to mirror, and you kind of get this, looks almost like a lake. Let me enlarge this. So what that does is basically make two copies, kind of a mirror effect. Now if I render this, let me just zoom out here, maybe put a different camera in, give it a wider lens so that we can just see more of what this sky is going to do. And so there we have now a nice looking sky here in this image. Now what if I wanted that to be a little bit brighter? One thing that I didn't mention a while ago. Now if you wanted to make this brighter and you're using the physical scale method, you can just keep increasing this value. For example, if I change it to 100,000 instead of 80,000 and give this a render, what that's going to do is brighten up the sky a little bit further. And so as you can see, it's a little bit brighter. It may be hard to tell, but it's just a little bit brighter. And now that's probably about right. Actually may want to go back to 80,000. So if you wanted it a little bit brighter, you can adjust that. Of course, as you also change your exposure settings, the entire image will become brighter or darker, depending on whether you go higher or lower. So for example, if I decrease that down to 10, it's probably going to be washed out. So as you can see, everything is increased with this exposure value, but you can sort of fine-tune the bitmap and the background via this unit list setting here. Alright, so that's one method, that's one approach. Let me just clear out this frame buffer and bring up, let me change my exposure back to 14. And let's bring back this material editor, because I'm just using that as the background map here in the physical sky. You can also assign this to the haze slot. First thing that you have to do in order to access that is, of course, uncheck this inherit from mental ray sky, because it's going to look for the mental ray sky here in the daylight system for these values until I uncheck that. And now let's just switch this. Let's pull this hemispherical map down here. I'm just going to tell it to swap because I don't want anything up here, and of course uncheck that so that it actually uses the sky again. And what's going to happen is it will use this haze, and the neat thing about this is that the mental ray sun will actually tint this map, so it looks kind of like the clouds may get tinted. So it can add to some realism. It can also detract a little bit if you don't want orange or yellow clouds, as often happens with this mental ray sun. It kind of gives you a more yellow tone towards the horizon. So let's just give this a try. Okay, now with that render, you can see a little bit of the clouds showing up here as that haze function. Let me go back over here. You don't necessarily need to change anything here on the haze value. What you do need to do is increase the strength of this bitmap again. Now you could probably come in here to the physical scale, but since I'm right here at this bitmap, I'm just going to go ahead and increase this. And actually, when you're using it here for the haze, you use kind of a small boost here, normally between like 6 and 10, I believe, is what works most of the time. So I'm just going to set that to 10, and as you can see, it gets brighter here in the viewport, in the material editor, I mean. But if I give this a render, the clouds, as you can see, show up now better here in the sky. And the neat thing about this, of course, is that the mental ray sun is actually tinting this cloud, because as you know from the looking at the image before, the clouds are basically white, but once it gets over here to this section, you'll see that it's kind of an orange tint, and that's coming from that mental ray sun here. Now once the sun gets up around noon, and that light becomes white, or if I come in and I manually change it to white, it will not produce this orange, so you can get your white clouds back, or neutral colored clouds back. Okay, so I believe that pretty much covers if you want to add clouds and still use that mental ray physical sky. And a simple way also is if I just cut this or clear it, delete it, whatever you want to say, and just drag this bitmap over, or assign a bitmap here. I'm just going to drag this one over as an instance copy, and let's decrease the output back down to 1. Okay, now if I give this a render, you'll see that we still have a cloudy environment here, sky. So that's just putting that background in the way that we used to do it before the mental ray physical sky come along. So that's another method of adding an environment to your scene. And this is the same method that you would use if you were using HDR images. I happen to be using low dynamic range images, these JPEGs. But if you're using HDRs or EXRs, the methods would be the same. Your output values may be slightly different, but where you place these would be identical. For me, the benefit of just assigning the bitmap here directly instead of going through the mental ray physical sky is pretty big, in that I actually get to see my bitmap here in the environment. And that would be kind of handy as far as if I wanted to place this a certain direction, if I wanted the clouds, maybe I wanted to rotate these and kind of give a sense of movement, or I just wasn't happy with the particular angle. I could change that and get real-time feedback here in the viewport. That doesn't look too attractive, but I'm sure you see where I'm coming from here. Let me just back that back down to 0. But that's one of the benefits to just directly assigning your bitmap to the environment slot. So with that, I'll complete this tutorial.